Chapter 1, Part 1 of Almond-Blossom. This is a Librivox Recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Almond-Blossom by Olive Wadsley. Chapter 1, Part 1. It is something to have smelt the mystic rose, although it break and leave the thorny rods. It is something to have hungered once as those must hunger who have ate the bread of gods. G.K. Chesterton. When he had quite finished breakfast, which he ate contentedly, and did not compare disparagingly with the set meal he would have had at home, but instead drank the really excellent coffee, and consumed rolls and confiture in large quantities, Rexford strolled out from under the shade of the pink and white tasselled awning, and surveyed the day. It was a day worthy of observation, a golden and blue day, a day of crystalline clearness and etched shadows, so white was the sunshine, a day unquestionably, in Rexford's opinion, in which to do something. Days generally meant that to him, especially in a town where the doing consisted in getting out of it, and if Pago was not exactly a town, it was a place of streets, and as such, meet to be left. Rexford lit a cigarette from a tiny lighter, and, true to type, looked round for a dog, and in looking round, had an instant's vision of the courtyard of his own place, with the kennel-man grooming one of the terriers, preferably Nick, as Nick was Rexford's best beloved. Still visioning Nick's amber eyes and exactly right coat and build, Rexford strolled back into the hotel and up to his wife's room. He walked with that very light swing of the shoulders, and even slighter looseness of gait, which is so sure a betrayal of an athlete, and as he waited for a moment after his knock, he loomed very large indeed against the white-painted, narrow door. Francesca was drinking her chocolate in bed, reading Rexford's letters for him, and planning his day. He kissed her hair, which was enchanting, and tied back like a little girl's, with a big ribbon bow, let himself down carefully into a frail wicker chair which groaned at him, stretched, smiled at Francesca, and said, "Well, what about it?" He had made just that same remark every morning during the tour, and Francesca had always met his need by letting him drive her to the place she thought he would like best, where he could either swim or fish or shoot, or at least watch others engaged in some relatively arduous sport. Those friends of Francesca who delighted to lay claim to that disturbing oddness known as perfect frankness, the last characteristic which should deserve this celestial qualification having regard to its effect on those who unwillingly receive its benefit, often told her she managed Tony. Francesca used to listen to them and smile, and relate their comment to Tony, and laugh. Tony laughed the louder. In point of fact, Francesca loved her husband. She had fallen in love with him at once, and though she was quite aware that he was, perhaps, not very quick, and that many people thought him heavy, whilst she agreed with them, she liked his heaviness, just as she liked his fair hair, well watered down in the morning and before dinner, but apt to become less sleek towards mid-afternoon, just as she liked his blue eyes and obstinate, boyish mouth, and his whole air of strength and bigness. This morning, in the filtered light of her room, he looked bigger than ever in his thin white suit. There was a knock at the door, and Miguel the waiter came in holding an armful of yellow roses, and beaming widely. He broke into a torrent of speech, descriptive of his own prowess in obtaining the flowers, their beauty, and the beauty of the noble Excellentissima, his wife, and of the generosity of the Excellency himself. Rexford lifted an eyebrow, handed the man 5 pesetas, and said, "Give 'em here, will you? Thanks." He held out the roses to Francesca. "I was afraid I mightn't get the right ones. Yellow, you know. Of course others wouldn't have been the same." He rose and sat down on the bed beside her, and they both laughed. He slid an arm round her. "Tragedy if that comic opera little chap hadn't been able to get 'em. Wouldn't it have been, darling, to-day of all days?" His wife put up a white arm, drew down his head, and kissed him. "You have the loveliest ideas, Tony," she said very gently, keeping his face to hers. Rexford beamed. "Oh, I don't know," he said in the happy voice of the really assured. "But getting married to any one like you takes a bit of forgetting, darling, you know. I say, Fay, I can remember to day how damn nervous I felt waiting for you to come up the aisle. It seemed an age, I can tell you, and when you did come, you looked such a little kid. You made me feel shy, almost frightened of you, as if I'd no right to have you at all." He sat up and lit a cigarette and gave it to Francesca, and added, lighting his own, "You know, darling, it seems pretty good to me to sit like this with you, as good as 10 years ago in one way. I say, you seem pretty silent, old lady. Anything up?" Francesca gave a shaky little laugh. "Nothing, parole d'honneur. But you must allow a wife to be touched by such an offering on the 10th anniversary of her wedding day. Some husbands, my dear, instead of buying golden roses, are scanning their passbooks to see if they can afford a divorce by that time." Rexford laughed. "Only the wrong sort, old girl. Question of a sense of values, or no sense, rather, in the beginning." He rose, and straightened his tie before the mirror. "I don't want to brag about my brilliance, Fay, you know, but you'll own I knew a good thing when I saw it." He strolled back to the bed and stood smiling down at her. "If you were thinking of getting up?" "Darling, at once. Call Matilda for me, will you, as you go out? Her door's the next but one on the right. But, Tony, just a minute. Come here." He turned back. "No, here. Here rest, then." He stood beside her again, a little mystified. She held out a hand to him. "Kneel down, darling. You're so far away. And don't look so frightened. No one is going to do anything to you. Tony." "Yes, old girl, what is it?" His puzzled eyes met hers unwaveringly. She drew his head suddenly close against her shoulder. "Tony, you have been so endlessly dear. You have said this morning things which have reached my heart, and, in a way, hurt it. No, don't move. I don't mean to hurt in one sense. It was your last remark about values. Oh, darling, have you had such a return? Don't you ever think it's rather hard luck when Charles comes with the boys?" Rexford forced up his head from under her restraining hand. "Now look here," he said strongly. "I do not, never have thought, as you call it, or regretted I took you hunting that time. We both believed it was all right, and the most tremendous bit of luck of all my life was when the doctors told me you'd live after the accident. Listen to me, Fay, and believe this. A man doesn't care a damn about anything but his wife when it's her life or anyone else's in the question. The choice is certain, inevitable. You simply don't choose. It's a fact, a part of life, because she's a part of your own life. As for Charles and the boys, I don't know I've ever seen a boy much more of a sport than young Charles, and if you labour under the delusion that I spend my life longing for the unattainable, it may interest you to learn, old girl, that I scarcely ever think of it." He rose, picked up her white silk peignoir, and held it out. She slipped into it, and he stood for a moment holding her so in his arms. Then he released her. "All right now?" "Absolutely." He tightened his hold of her, laughing down at her. "Nothing but a baby sometimes, are you, what? Get a move on with your dressing now, won't you? I'm off to buy some of those native cigarettes as an experiment. They're like young cigars, and pretty strong, I should think." Francesca heard him go downstairs, pause for a moment in the hall, then from the window she watched him stroll down the uneven little street. "Darling, darling liar," she whispered. And to himself Rexford was saying, "I did that thundering well. She never had the faintest notion I was bluffing, and Fay's absolutely one of the best. It's simply rough luck on us, that's all, and it's no good grousing. Young Charles will do the place credit. That's a comfort." He thought, as he walked along, that Spain seemed a country of which babies appeared to approve. They swarmed on every doorstep. Each dusty gutter was someone's royal kingdom. A child toddled up to him, skilled already, at the ripe age of 3 or 4, in the art of appeal, and begged urgently. Rexford burst out laughing, gave the baby a peseta, and listened to a fluent flow of thanks. But other babies had watched the luck of this favoured pioneer. They made a bee-line for Rexford, and whilst the unsteady clutched his trousers as a support, the older ones clung to his hands, and his ears were assailed by a torrential lisping. "Well, I don't know," he said, smiling down at his exigent adorers. "Here, catch, you infant pirates." He flung a handful of small coins to them, watched them scramble, of course compensated the luckless, and then walked on in search of his cigarettes. He wondered, for the 100th time, what Fay would say to adopting a little kid for the fun of the thing, and, facing the truth to himself, to give life that interest which it lacked for him. Yet not for an instant would he have dreamt of hinting at this idea. It recurred again and again, though, whilst he loitered in the sunshine waiting for Francesca, and watched the apparently endless families possessed by every self-respecting Spaniard disporting themselves in the warm dust. Some men are born with the protective instinct of paternity. It is sufficiently rare to find a man who is not fond of children, but there are men in whom this feeling is a profound quality, and who stand in a finer relationship to life by reason of this quality than any other they possess. In this category heredity and choice had placed Rexford, and his inclusion made him a good landlord, a perfect uncle, and a chivalrous soul, and as well, deny the fact as he might, a dissatisfied man. Paradoxically, the quality which spurred his nature to discontent was the very one which prevented his voicing that discontent, for that protectiveness, which was one of the strongest tenets of his creed, was naturally a keenest influence with regard to Francesca, and whatever joy a certain course of action might afford Tony, he would never mention it to Francesca, because he knew quite well that it would hurt her, however she might dissemble to him. He was not a particularly unselfish man, simply he loved his wife. She was his own. She came down onto the veranda now, and waved to him with a white sunshade. In the searching sunshine she looked about 24. In reality she was 34, but she had that extremely English complexion which seems neither to fade nor thicken, and that hair which is like both ashes and gold, palely golden hair. She had always been called beautiful. As a matter of fact, she was an extremely pretty woman, who was very beautifully cared for, a woman who possessed the gift of appearance, and who would have seemed chic had she been poor. She was slender to the verge of thinness, and dressed, therefore, to add to the first effect and conceal the latter. Rexford crossed to her, and put up the white, green-lined sunshade. "I've ordered the car," Francesca told him, pulling on loose wash-leather gloves. "We'll go to the river, don't you think, and perhaps we might get a bath after lunch? I've had our suits packed." "Oh, splendid," Rexford said. The car came round as he spoke, a touring car with the hood up because of the heat. Rexford always drove himself. Motoring in every detail was a passion with him, and one of which he never tired. When he was not in one of his cars, he was probably about it, or under it, a pipe glued between his teeth, and a hoarse hissing noise accompanying his labours. The car was always alluded to with affection as she, and her actions and virtues occupied much space in Rexford's conversation. The Spanish tour had been partly, and most enjoyably, spent in tinkering up the quite perfect rolls, each day after its trials and tribulations, over the worst roads probably in Europe. All Rexford's servants adored him. Carville, the chauffeur, who had, it was understood, passed intricate examinations in motor engineering, would bridle with pleasure when Rexford argued with him, quite wrongly, on some technical point, and murmur, "Yes, my lord," for the sheer pleasure of receiving his master's attention. He settled in the back now, whilst Rexford took the wheel, and after walking the car through the village children, he let it out on the Seville road. As they rushed along, Francesca noticed that the aloe trees were in full flower. They held themselves with dauntless upright splendour, despite the menace of the dust. Occasionally a shrine was visible. One shone out by reason of a wreath of orange blossom some worshipper had placed upon the cross, where it glowed in the white sunshine like a living crown of stars. Oxen-drawn carts, leisurely affairs which zigzagged about, trailed peacefully along the road, their drivers refusing with bovine obstinacy to hurry in spite of Rexford's free speech, the irate Carvel's infuriated adjuration, and Francesca's laughter. "It's so nice to slow up. Then one can really see things," she explained to Rexford, whose face was set in lines of resigned yet savage irritation, that expression common to those true motorists who get into a car for the purpose of getting out of it again in the shortest possible space of time, and who expect, nay, demand, that any obstruction in their road shall also get out, likewise in record time. To these ardent pacemakers the car, as a vehicle for sightseeing, for casual enjoyment of the summer breeze, simply is not. To them, to slow down is a grievance, to stop for any purpose save that of arrival, anathema. The orchestra of heaven might have played music of exultant sweetness above the bonnet, but to such a car lover as Rexford, one rhythmic purr of a just so engine would have been far more beautiful than any celestial strain, and the cries of the tortured damned would have moved him far less than one squeak from a nut which needed oil. Francesca, aware of this outlook, made no effort to oppose it. She knew better than to distract an absorbed mind by any allusion to the beauty of nature, or to show a desire to discuss any topic save the going of the car. Upon their arrival at Barasio, when he had made a preliminary but searching inspection of the car, Tony would again become his usual pleasant self. After he had, in all probability, delivered a spirited and abstruse monologue on the good behaviour of the car as evidenced by the drive, touched lightly on any feat of steering afforded him by the obstructive and accursed traffic, and generally given a technical word sketch of the engine's prowess at every milestone of the road, he would ask Francesca if she had not enjoyed the country through which they had passed. This, save for the isolated moments when a goat, an ox, or any two-footed, equally infamous idiot, bent apparently upon speedy suicide, had held up their progress, had been to Francesca, by reason of the amazing speed, merely an indistinguishable blur of dust, and green and yellow patches which custom and instinct had helped her to recognize as fields, and which, having due regard to the obligations of matrimony, she had accepted as a view, and would then dilate upon as charming scenery to Tony. To-day proved no exception to the rule. Tony got out, helped Francesca, and instantly bent over the car in an attitude which displayed at once the excellent fit of his suit, and enabled him to peer into the recesses of the engine. Carvel hovered about him, and both men murmured darkly to one another. Francesca strolled into the hotel, a little inn-like place with the same vine-covered veranda and pink walls and little stained tables as the Pago place, and ordered luncheon. And in due course Tony joined her, clamouring as usual for a wash, a drink, and his food. He came back to the veranda very shortly, favoured Francesca with his views on the drive, as per schedule, and then, having filled his glass, asked heartily, "Enjoyed it, old girl? Liked the scenery?" Francesca mentioned the aloe trees, the dust, the shrine, and Tony grunted appreciably. When he had finished an excellent lunch, he suggested, the car being now housed in a shed, and its rest guarded by the faithful Carvel, that they should look over the place before driving out to the river for their swim. They strolled together down the main street, both smoking cigarettes, Francesca's hand linked in Tony's elbow. The street was silent, ice cool, sun hot, as the houses let in the light or obstructed it. Like so many Cordovan towns, the place gave a strange impression of aloofness, of chill, half contemptuous indifference to modernity and its claims. These towns seem never to lose entirely the effect of their ancient Eastern rule, a rule at once more subtle and more ruthless than any other. It seems as if a faint imprint of that sinister influence still lingers. There are still echoes of savage, stifled feuds, smothered cries, inexorable yet hidden tyrannies, trifling yet significant echoes of the centuries' dead omnipotence. "Rum old place," Tony said, as halting before the church of San Pablo he stared up at it gravely, shutting his eyes for an instant against the dazzling effect made by the sunshine striking the black and white tiles of the roof. "Let's go in," Francesca said suddenly. "All right." They threw away their cigarettes, and Tony pushed open a small door. Before it there hung a heavy leather curtain, and as he held it for Francesca to pass in, it seemed to her as if a visible cool peace met her gently. She sat just inside the church, and Tony stood behind her. The sun was pouring through one small window, and its spear of goldenness was thick inset with gorgeous green and scarlet and purple jewels from the coloured glass. No one was in the church save their two selves. It was very, very dark and chill and austere, and yet it seemed to Francesca kindly. Near by was an altar to the Virgin, and Francesca deciphered the words engraved on the stone railing, behind which the candles burnt high and clear in the still air. "For those we love." She slipped a hand into Tony's pocket and took out some money, and went across to the little shrine and bought candles and lit them. Tony watched her. Like every other man of his type, he did not think much about religion. Indeed, it is probable he never deliberately thought of it, but he believed in it nevertheless. He classed it inevitably in his mind with the stability of the empire to which he had the honour to belong, and all enduring country things, the soil, freshness, and rain. But for one instant his eyes on Francesca's bent slender form, the faint mist of goldenness visible beneath her hat, imagery touched his mind. He went forward and knelt beside her, remembering indistinctly and yet rather poignantly their marriage, the child's death, their home, their life together. Francesca smiled at him, and he put an arm about her and drew her up. Out in the sunshine, back to normality again, he gave a quick sigh. He was grateful for normality and the sunshine and the lizard strolling for once in Francesca's direction. "Let's get a move on, shall we?" he asked. He glanced at Francesca as he walked beside her. The day had held one or two pretty stiff moments, their talk that morning, then this church business. He said, "I say, Fay, we shall have to celebrate tonight, you know. Get some decent champagne from somewhere. And you must tug up, old girl. Do your damnedest." Francesca understood exactly why he seemed rather more robustly ordinary than usual. She agreed to his suggestions gaily, and by the time they reached the inn, Tony had lost his sense of little shadows, as she had fully meant he should do. They raced off again, of course this time in the direction of the river, which, at the pace they went, they reached most speedily. It glittered gorgeously before them, shining like a chain of emeralds set in silver. Unfortunately, however, the bank afforded no shelter at all, though they ran along it for some miles. Then in the distance a rough tent appeared. "That'll do," Tony said. "We'll pay 'em to let us use it." But upon arrival the tent proved to be empty, though a litter of household things and a string of washing outside testified to the fact it had been occupied that morning. Tony peered in. "It's all right," he said, withdrawing his head. "Bit of a frost, but you needn't be in there long. Cut on in now, and if anyone turns up before you're ready, I'll speak 'em fair." Francesca slid out of her clothes very swiftly, and into her bathing suit. She stepped on to the sand, which struck hot through her sandals just as Tony plunged into the water and shouted to her that it was topping, icy cold, ripping. He swam magnificently. He was already far downstream by the time Francesca had made a dozen strokes. A bridge, a rough stone affair, low, bending, uneven, crossed the river a few hundred yards away. Tony had nearly reached it when Francesca heard him shout and saw him dive, come up, and dive again, and then she saw on the bridge, rocking herself in frenzy of emotion, a woman, and a moment later the whole episode was one of 2 minutes perhaps Tony reappeared, his fair head close to another smaller head, swimming overhand and making for the bank. Francesca swam in too, and ran towards him, catching up her bathing wrap as she ran. Tony was already on his knees beside the child, a mere baby of 2 or 3, and was attempting artificial respiration. Francesca knew the movements. She, too, knelt down, and helped to work the tiny arms. She was conscious, as the blinding sunshine fastened on her back like a blister, of an incessant noise, and once she looked up and saw the baby's mother weeping uncontrollably, and between her sobs imploring each saint by name to save her little one, and a youth expostulating, swearing, sobbing too, standing beside her. "Not much good, 'fraid," Tony gasped at last, straightening up a little and thrusting back the hair from his forehead. "Bad luck indeed. Hoped we'd save the poor little beggar." And just then the baby opened the greenest eyes Francesca had ever seen, and smiled deliberately at Tony, meeting his glance with a sort of steady delight, seeming by that radiant smile to acknowledge his help and make further claim on him in one. Tony sat back and roared with laughter, and Francesca bent over the baby and worked on it again until it protested unsmilingly and vehemently. The parents came forward and burst into ecstatic thanks, to which Tony mumbled self-consciously, "All right, all right." His voice seemed to have a restraining influence on the baby, which had been crying stormily in its mother's arms. It stopped as he spoke, and again that gorgeous green-eyed smile appeared, made especially for Tony, smiled only at Tony. "You rum little devil," he said to it, and to Fay, "I say, it's rather a jolly baby, what?" "She recognizes her rescuer. She knows you anyway, Tony," Francesca answered. "Do you know, I believe she does," Tony said. "What's her name?" he asked the mother. "Dolores Juana, señor." "Is it, by Jove? Well," he advanced and lifted one tiny hand. "Well, Dolores Juana, here's to a future meeting." The mother urged him with a languishing glance, and Dolores played her trump card. She smiled. Tony, grinning a little, kissed her. Of course Francesca had seen him kiss children before, as men do kiss them, rather solemnly and with a countenance expressive of relief, when the deed is well accomplished. But somehow, seeing Tony looking as he looked at the moment, absurdly boyish, with his hair still ruffled from the water, and clad in his bathing suit, an indescribable sensation stirred in her heart. It was as if something had closed down on it, and, holding it captive, forced it forward to accept a realization. In that instant, without quite knowing that she did so, yet aware of its advent in her mind, she presaged the future. All that happened after that golden afternoon was but a fulfilment of that first intuition. The sway exercised by that sixth sense faded quickly. Francesca bade farewell to the mother, kissed the baby too. Tony plunged into the river and swam to the car. In half an hour they were ready. As Francesca turned to leave the tent, the habitual dwelling place, it appeared, of the parents of Dolores Juana, she heard Tony's voice in obvious converse with the lady of the smile herself. His conversation consisted of alternate "hellos" and "rum little devils," with laughter at frequent intervals, overtures to friendship much appreciated by the baby, apparently, since Francesca could hear a funny little chuckle, and when she went out of the tent, found Dolores Juana seated comfortably on Tony's knee, gripping the lapel of his blazer, and nearly asleep. Her eyes closed as Francesca appeared. Tony looked up with an expression of amused questioning. "Rather done me this time," he whispered. Francesca stood above the two of them, and again that bitter contraction of her heart made her wince. "Oh, don't bother," she said, in a voice she forced to be light. "I'll call the mother. We'll start for home, I think. It's been rather a strenuous afternoon, hasn't it?" She was sickeningly aware that Tony's seraphic expression changed to one of apologetic anxiety. He rose to his feet instantly, holding the baby as carefully as he could, and walked towards the mother and gave it into her arms. The girl curtsied and broke into a torrent of exaggerated gratitude, but the young husband scowled. Francesca called, "I'm ready, Tony." Carvel brought the car nearer. Tony thrust a hand into a pocket and drew out a note. He pushed it very gently into the baby's hand. "You get her something," he said to the mother. "Goodbye." The father, softened by the contemplation of Tony's gift, asked with the ready effusion of the skilled idler, to whom pleasantness is an asset, "The Señor is of course a father? One sees how he loves children." Francesca heard Tony say, "No, I have no children," and instantly the mother of Dolores broke into a torrent of commiseration, checked suddenly by the inspiration that the Señor and his lovely Señora might perhaps be on their honeymoon. Tony's confession of the actual celebration of the day brought a murmur of wonder, of concern. It all seemed to Francesca grotesquely arch, and yet painful. Then distinctly she heard the young man say, "The Señor should adopt a little one," and at once Tony's head veered round a little way in Francesca's direction. She could see his face and the dark smiling face of the other man, and Dolores Juana smiling. Tony was speaking. She could not hear what he said, but she knew. Oh, she knew. End of Chapter 1, Part 1 of Almond-Blossom by Olive Wadsley. Recording by Maricel Cui.